Hello all. I sit here today, February the 20th, 5785, 2025, broken along with the rest of the Jewish world and the world of humanity in terms of all that is swirling around us. It's a very difficult day for those of us that are part of the Bnei Yisrael. It's our mother, our sister, our father, our Saba, our children, our grandchildren. We all relate to the Bibas family. And there are no words. There are no words. So as we explore Parshat Mishpatim, we ask the question, how do we legislate ethical and moral behavior? I've often spoken in this space, as well as others, about the notion that we cannot always legislate what it means to be right, that is ethically and morally right or correct. We know this all too well just by looking around the world and seeing what is going on today, as well as in the past, through our study of so many historical chapters, through looking at who our leaders are and what they do and how they legislate. How do we legislate morality and ethical standards? Basically, we don't. Not only that, if one is doing what is legally permitted, even mandated, this does not ensure ethical and moral behavior. I would suggest that this standard can only be met by believing in something greater than ourselves, telling us how to behave, because in our case, God says so. Secular humanists might opine, as some indeed have in my conversations with them, that doing A or B or not doing C or D because God says so is not subscribing to ethical standards. I acknowledge their point and at the same time would stress that ethical monotheism, the system of Torah law to which we are supposed to subscribe, begins with those standards and then turns them into action items which involve moral and ethical behaviors in a world that way too often may seem anything but that. It is most noteworthy to acknowledge that this listing of moral and ethical mandated behaviors in our Parsha begin with those relating to our most vulnerable populations, our servants, our daughters who may not have agency for themselves and others, for whom those with agency are responsible to ensure their safety, their dignity, and their well-being. We are commanded, that is legislated, not to ignore them, but specifically to ensure their safety and well-being. This is mandated for us as individuals and collectively as a community. For those of us who are constantly feeling disappointed in so much in our world today, imagine, just imagine, if we would all live by that standard. Let's consider how this discussion of our Parsha begins. Ve'ela Mishpatim asher tasim lifnechem. God told Moshe, these are the Mishpatim, and we are taught that these are the laws, that even if they were not mandated as such, we would do them. In other words, our ethical and moral standards would dictate that within us. Further, Rashi teaches the Ve'ela Mishpatim, and these are the laws. Whenever a section begins with Ela, these, it disconnects from what was stated previously. But when a section begins Ve'ela and these, it connects and adds to what was stated previously. Therefore, teaches Rashi, this Ve'ela explains that just as the 10 Commandments, Ma Rishonim Misinai, Af Elu Misinai, were written first and received first, these too are written and received in the same spirit. So why is this section dealing with civil laws placed following the passage about the construction of the altar? To tell you that you must place the Sanhedrin, that body that is empowered to legislate, next to the temple. That we must ensure our proper behaviors, our proper moral and ethical standards are as important and symbiotically tied to the Esrar Debrot, to the 10 Commandments, to the place that housed them, to the tabernacle, to the Mishkan. In other words, both are needed for each to be viable. Further, while many would suggest that Judaism is all about ritual, that is, laws that legislate religious observance, here we learn, ve'ela Mishpatim, that the ethical and moral standards indicated are just as important. In fact, when one opens the Gemara, the Mishnah Torah, and any other number of texts explicating the Torah teachings and detailing their words as well as intents, this is clear. Further, these ethical and moral standards are to inform our business practices, our relationship with others in our lives, and in short, every action throughout our day. In other words, our 24/7 behavior. Recently, for example, I was learning in Hilchot Shchenim, in Rambam's Mishnah Torah, which deals with, among other practices, how far from one's neighbor's boundary is one permitted to plant or build, how one is to minimize the size of their porch in a closed alley so that people can meander and go through the area, the placement of a ladder to access a property while not endangering others, and so on, is to ensure that neighbors are considerate of neighbors and that there is peace and well-being for all. This is our law. This is legislated. It should be enticing and beneficial and accepting to and for all to be considerate of each other, to act morally, to act ethically for the benefit of all, to protect the very contours of society in which we live. We are taught the concept of Livnim Meshort Adin, going above and beyond the letter of the law in our system of Torah law, the absolute antithesis of the reasoning, which we see way too often, where people try to get away with everything they can just on the boundary of what is acceptable and what is not, according to the legislated law. We will examine briefly just 3 examples of how this works in our system of Torah law that distinguishes it from man-made legal codes. For example, it is known and historically confirmed that servants in cultures that designate them as subservient and with less rights have no expectations of receiving the privileges or the considerations as free people or landowners. However, take note of this proscribed behavior and standard in our Parsha regarding a bondwoman whom the son of a landowner wishes to take on as his wife. Understandably, these practices need to be seen contextually, within their time frame, within who had agency and who didn't. Women did not have the position in society that we have come to expect today. And by the way, in many parts of the world, they still don't. So consider that when you hear this and absorb what it's saying. We learn. If the master designates her, livno, for his son, as a wife, he must accord her this rights, Mishpatim, that are accorded to all of the daughters of Israel. In other words, if the father agrees, the son may designate her for a wife, but he must observe the various restraints and conditions of Kedushin, and he must accord her the rights as a wife. And what are these standards? What's Mishpat Abanot? Rashi teaches, Sha'ar Kosod Va'ona, the standard rights of girls, food, clothing, conjugal rights. If he marries an additional wife, as the text continues, he may not take or reduce the clothing, the food, or the conjugal rights of the first wife. In other words, these are the laws of Benot Yisrael, and this Mishpat Abanot, this judgment of how one deals with our daughters at that time, applies to the servant that is taken for a son's wife. She is a wife, and she is accorded all the rights and privileges of being so. That is to say, her role cannot be diminished, nor may her position be retracted. This is a completely novel concept when looking at other legal codes from this time and others. Secondly, here is yet another line of delineation in which we note levels of intent and reality of how an act of ending a life can impact the community. Makeh ish umet mut yumat. An adult who strikes a man so that the latter dies must be put to death. Now, there are seemingly superfluous words and verses in these teachings. However, again, the one who strikes a person and they die, he will surely die. Why is this said? Ki kol nefesh adam mut yumat. Any nefesh of a human being, that man, woman, child, etc., anyone is killed, that person must be put to death. So it specifically says, B'makeh ish v'umat, and a person who strikes a person and they die. In other words, he is not liable to be killed unless he kills him. In other words, if you beat him up but he doesn't die, it doesn't count. So then we have the question, how do we know that this is true for a woman or a child? And Scripture therefore says, our Torah says, if a man strikes any human being, ish here is meant to be any human being, Adam. That's what Rashi is teaching, that here it means Adam, any human being, including a child or a woman. So then the question is, what if a child commits such a crime? That's why it says, ish, the person who kills, is an adult and not a child who strikes. But if a person strikes another human being, and we know this from if a woman is pregnant and she's carrying a child and the child dies, then the death penalty or the idea of meting out death does not apply, because that is a potential for life. It's not a full life. But a child, even of one day, is a full life. And the commentaries will differ on this, because this is related to Pidyon HaBen, for those of you that are aware of that event, that a child who's born, when they take their first breath, is considered viable, but not stable until they've lived 30 days. So there are some machloket on that point. Then we read, but wait a minute, if he didn't intend to kill, but it happened, the words that are used, that it just occurred, that somehow there were these circumstances and it occurred, then v'samti l'cha makom asher yanus shama. We will give that person a place to flee to go to, so that his life will be protected and others will not kill him. In other words, it was not intentional. So a couple of things. Number one, all life matters. We're not talking about various strata of people in society. In other words, we're not talking about a person who's more important or less important, or a Kohen or a Levi. This is Kol Ish. Every life matters, woman, child, man, and all the categories they're in. And if it's intentional, then that is what is taught here. If it's unintentional, we give the person a place to go to be protected. And then additionally, we read, V'chi yazid ish al re'ehu, that he really intended to kill his neighbor and killed him lahargo ba'arma, with guile. Me'im mizbachi tichachenu lamut. And he holds on to the altar. And from this, by the way, we get the notion of sanctuary. My daughter, who I'm so proud of, was working with families who were threatened with deportation and various terrible things. And they found sanctuary in places of worship. And this is the idea of holding on to the Mizbeach. One who comes and finds sanctuary, but he killed intentionally, you take him away. So the places for people to flee are for those who did not intend to kill, and something happened and the person died. But if the person does intend to kill, they cannot exercise that right of sanctuary. So we learn, v'chi yazid, if a person acts intentionally. What does this mean? Why is this verse added? Once it says hamakeh ish, the person who strikes a human being, don't we understand that to be intentional? But someone might have understood that even one who killed a non-Jew, or a doctor who caused the death of a patient during treatment, or an emissary of the judicial court who caused the death of someone while administering the lashes, or a teacher who disciplines his pupil, or one who mistakenly causes the death of another, should not be put to death. Therefore, we add this verse, v'chi yazid. In other words, it's a process. He who intentionally kills any human being, he shall be put to death. If it's unintentional, you put him in the Area Miklat, in the cities of sanctuary. If he holds on to the Mishkan and he says, the Mizbeach, and he says, I didn't, whatever, but you know he intended to kill, you take him from the Mizbeach. Why? Ki yazid, because it was intentional. So we make this very clear distinction so that there should be no doubt about what we're talking here. There should be no doubt about to whom this applies and to whom it does not apply. There are lines of delineation that are not made elsewhere that indicate there are moral and ethical issues with how we implement a standard. Notice all of the goalposts indicated here so that what is legislated is not misinterpreted. It's not used vicariously. And it's not used outside of the parameters of that which is intended. As these instructions continue, we see dictated behaviors regarding one's animals, one's fields, responsibility for the safety of the community, how justice must be meted out judiciously and properly, not at the whim of whomever is involved in such a process. What I find fascinating is that every person of every station in life is included in these dictates, as well as our ongoing responsibility for each other. Yet, while so much is legislated, how can we accurately ascertain that all those around us have the intention to follow the letter as well as the spirit and the meaning of the law? This is clearly a formidable challenge, so very present in our lives. For our final example, consider the following from chapter 23. Lo tisa shema shav al tasit yadecha im rashaliyot. Ed Hamas. You must not accept a false report. You must not join with a wicked person by promising to be a corrupt witness. What does this mean? You must not accept a false report. So Onkelos explains, this is an injunction against accepting slander, and also that a judge cannot listen to the claims of one litigant before the other litigant arrives. It's very interesting to me that if you look at a lot of civil law, a lot of the standards that we use in our everyday lives, they actually come from these teachings. The notion of how a court case is held, and that the accuser must be able to be there when the accused speaks, and so on and so forth. Al taset yadecha im rasha. Do not join forces with a wicked person against one making a false claim by promising to be a corrupt witness. Liot lo ed hamas. So Rashi is looking at this as a cumulative dynamic, not as separate teachings, but how one leads to the other. False reports lead to joining forces with those that make false reports, and then to become a corrupt witness. And then the very next verse says, Lo tiach harei rabim lara'ot. You do not follow the majority to do evil, and you may not stray below ta'aneh arav tot from the truth and follow the incorrect majority. A very important teaching and standard for our lives today. How much of the crowd mentality has created so many problems for so many of us. If you see a wicked person perverting justice, says Rashi, you do not say, they're the majority, I will follow them. Think about that in terms of everything from bullying. Those of you that watch the news know that a child in Texas, an 11-year-old child, died by suicide because of the bullying that she was subjected to in school and could not take it anymore. To governments that act against their own citizens, to groups that malign whole other entities of individuals, and so on. We do not say, the Rabim hem hineni noteh acharehem. Because they're the majority, even if they're the cool kids in class, I will not follow them. V'lo taneh arov linatot v'chulei. You must not respond about a dispute to endanger the proper justice process. That is, if the defendant asks you, this is Rashi, about the ruling, you do not respond about the dispute in a manner similar to the wicked majority. Well, the majority says X, so I'm going to go along with them, even though I know it's wrong. In other words, we are enjoined here to stand by our convictions according to the words of God. Whether it involves those that are vulnerable in our population as the first example, whether we're dealing with someone who has killed, was it intentional? Who did he kill? What were the circumstances? Do we protect him? Do we prosecute? And watching our words, which are always a potential problem in our lives. We cannot be swayed by the majority who wants to pervert justice or corrupt society. Let's think about this for a moment in the context of our lives today. With all the bullying that I've been speaking about and misinformation that bombards us daily, trying to get us to do exactly what we are not supposed to do, it is often difficult, if not nearly impossible, to maintain our convictions about what is right and legal, both in terms of set legislation and understood ethics and morality. I have noted that many of my colleagues have been silenced Too many are no longer doing the work of trying to bring disparate groups together, trying to stand up for what's right. Too many are going off to the far right or to the far left and not living with the nuanced chaos and difficulties and conflicts in the middle. It makes it all the more important that those of us who are holding on for dear life and trying to continue to do this work do so. We are not following the majority that gives us the misinformation. What if proposed legislation in our lives goes against these very ethics and morals? There have been more than a few who have suggested that, unfortunately, too many of the leaders in our lives today are doing exactly that. Comparisons have often been made between the Code of Torah law and the Code of Hammurabi. But, and this is a huge but, here is the most profound difference. Each and every person in Torah law is of equal stature. And in many cases where there are exclusions due to obligations that some groups have that others don't, or that others just can't do, or whatever the reason is, there is an attempt to include all who can be included. Each and every person is of equal stature in the eyes of the one who administers the law of Torah, namely Ribono Shel Olam. Not a king, not a monarchy, not an autocracy, not an individual who power grabs. Hashem. In fact, one is not to judge based on stature or position, either grand or not so, but rather on the merits of the case presented. All are to pay their equal share of taxes and support the community, because God says so. This is amplified in Parshat Kedoshim, which comes a bit later in the year. While many of these dictates are repeated with the refrain oft repeated that the reason is because God is directing all that happens. We must treat everyone appropriately as the bondswoman or the daughters who are vulnerable. We must make all appropriate accommodations for various types of death by accident or intentional. We are commanded to not listen to misinformation or blasphemous reports that can and will destroy, because we are all accountable to God, and God created us all. Here is the fundamental difference. In the Code of Hammurabi, all are accountable to and intended to work for the king. For us as ethical monotheists, God is our king. We operate automatically and eternally with a no king's law. In that fashion, it is ethics and morals that define our legislation, not the other way around. I end this talk today with prayers for all who are being so damaged and hurt by what's going on in our world, with prayers for the innocent souls who have died, and with hope that somehow enough of us are continuing to do this work so that we can collectively heal our very fractured world. May ethics and morals guide us all in everything that we do. Shabbat Shalom.